mouse over that and write your question in the Q&A box, and we'll get to it a little bit later. So Gail, I'll turn it over to you.
Welcome. I'm very excited. What a wonderful group to be talking to and questioning. But I'm going to begin with Julia. So why this book and why now?
Well, thanks to everybody here tonight, those of us speaking together and the Carter Center, and also, of course, Gail and Tom and everybody tuning in. Why this book and why now? Well, Gail, you heard a little bit from the introduction and we were talking earlier that I worked in foreign policy issues for many, many years before pivoting to this topic, and often found myself the only woman in the room. I bet you can relate to that. And at a certain point, two things just started to sink in. One, I really wanted to zoom out a little bit and think about the matter of women and power very broadly, but I didn't have a topic. I also wanted to teach myself something new and pivot away from Latin America and Cuba and American foreign policy, because one doesn't need to do and think about the same thing one's whole life. It was really just that simple. I did not know at the time, when I was a woman in search of a woman to write about, that Lady Bird Johnson had kept this vast trove of audio diary while she was in the White House. I think of them as the other LBJ tapes. I didn't know it, but as soon as I started listening to them and reading the material in the secondary literature about the Johnson presidency, I was just, that was it. That was the story for me to write. And it was several years ago that I started, but now is a moment when I think we're thinking a lot about women and power and how we navigate it and achieve it and use its tools. And that's what this book is about.
It's fascinating. I just thought of this as you were talking. Wouldn't it be amazing with today's technology for you and Michael Beschloss to take the two sets of tapes and put them together day by day, the LBJ ones and hers, and hear the different interpretations?
Well, we did that actually in our podcast that we produced with ABC News. I know this is a CNN crowd, but we did that with ABC News and pulled together, and also not just the audio, but even when you line up LBJ's daily diary and the other LBJ's daily diary and look at how their days did and didn't mesh and on what issues they were connected and not connected, it really does sort of blow open the story of those White House years, I think.
Fascinating. So there's one quick question, because people always wonder, and that is, where did the LBJs come from? Because Lady Bird was her name before she was a Johnson, and everybody was an LBJ.
Well, I mean, that's part of the alchemy between the two of them, I suppose. But they named their daughters, of course, right, Linda Bird and Lucy Baines, and I suppose it just became sort of a family thing. But there's no good answer to the origin story on that one.
Okay, great. So Tom, we were talking about how wonderful the book is before everybody came on, and Tom, one of the things we all said was there were things that surprised us, that we thought we knew a lot about the Johnsons, and the more we read, the more we learned things we didn't know. So I'm curious, Tom, I'm going to begin with you and then Julia. What was the one thing that stood out the most that you learned about Mrs. Johnson that you didn't realize or know what dynamic before you read the book?
I did not know the depth of the hurt and the pain that the Eartha Kitt episode had, and that's covered so well in it. I also was startled to learn that President Johnson told Anatoly Dobrynin, the then Soviet ambassador to Washington, of his March 31st decision before he told a few of his own high-ranking administration executives. I mean, I should just say, though, this book conveys so much more about Lady Bird Johnson than I knew. I worked for 4 years in the White House, 2 as a deputy to George Christian, 2 as an assistant to Bill Moyers. and then 4 years in Texas, both as executive assistant to the former president and then as executive vice president of their family business. And I should tell you, this to me is a must read. It really is for anybody who would like to have an understanding, not just of the personality of Lady Bird Johnson, but of the history of those times. And of course, what an incredible strength she provided, both to her man all the way through, but the way in which she fought in her own way for rights of women. The best example of that, and it was one that I never knew, was that she really did not support Thurgood Marshall for the Supreme Court. She said to him,
Right.
Lyndon, it's time for a woman.
Yeah,
That's
I love
just one
that.
of the many nuggets in here, Julia, that you've unearthed that just tremendous. I mean, this book will change a lot of the history of those years because you have it accurately, you have it documented. Just a tremendous job.
I'm so emotional hearing you, and I know we're having a serious conversation about serious history, Tom, but that just means so much to me to hear you of all people say that. And I love the idea of surprising readers, especially a reader that lived these experiences. It tells us, don't you think, another element of Lady Bird, which was how patient she was, and how her understanding of history, her appreciation of historian of history, her training as a journalist, gave her perspective to leave all of this documentary material that she left and understand at some level that we'd piece it together.
Yes.
Eventually.
So
But
Julia,
thank you very much.
what surprised you the most when you started reading? Is there one particular thing that struck you the most?
I can't give you one answer, but I'm so tickled that Tom mentioned the Dobrynin piece of it,
Yeah.
which was in his memoir. By the way, that's where I found that. You know, I have to say that I was very surprised by Lady Bird's discipline and eloquence in leaving this body of material. That's for starters. I mean, that's what made this possible. That in the midst of so much tumult and polarization and tragedy and difficulty and triumphs too, not to sound too cliche, she did this with such discipline and rigor. And that definitely surprised me. The other thing that really surprised me, because it's so different than I think the received wisdom about the Johnson presidency in terms of his exit, was her influence in developing the strategy as early as she did, and their partnership around that, as I lay out in the beginning of the book and then trace in the end in that document that I had the audacity to rename and call the Huntland Strategy Memo. This was called a letter in the LBJ library, but it really, it stunned me, because when I tracked it against all of the other material, it was so clear to me how essential it was in laying out the arc of the presidency when they'd barely even started it, and how important, how much trust he gave her, and how much her judgment mattered to him. I think I was really surprised by that, because LBJ's, as the kind of mythology was this, dominant, powerful personality, and she was this subordinate kind of victim of his vulgarity and really kind of sidelined and very traditional. And in fact, this shows much more of a co-equal enterprise.
Right. No, very, very interesting. I thought the Huntsman memo was fascinating. Talk about it a little more for people about how she really outlined what 1964 was going to be for them.
Right. So in May of 1964, so they had only been in the White House for 4 or 5 months, and Vietnam was starting to bear down on them. McNamara was coming back from his 5th trip in as many months from Vietnam, and the message coming from McNamara and the rest of the Kennedy War Council was escalate in Vietnam. The war on poverty legislation hadn't passed. The civil rights legislation was stuck in the Congress, and LBJ was looking ahead to the election and the campaign and then the presidential election in the fall of '64, and really asking and having a lot of self-doubt about whether even if he won, he would be able to keep the country united and hold it together. He was very insecure about Vietnam. He couldn't see a way not to escalate. He couldn't see a way to get out. And he asked Lady Bird, and I just love picturing them, you know, because they're on the phone all the time. She was out in Middleburg, Virginia at a estate called Huntland, where he had had his heart attack in 1955. And they're talking on the phone, and he's got a terrible toothache, which is a great metaphor, of course. And he says, well, you know, they're turning over every rock as they did so much. And he says, well, you write it out for me. Lay out the pros and cons. Should I run? Should I not run? And that's what this memo is. It's a strategy memo that lays out what it would look like for him not to run, how he would feel, how she would feel if they were to go back to Texas when he was too young of a man. And then the alternative, which is that he should run, that he would very likely win, she writes. And then she says, in February or March of 1968, you can announce to the country that you won't be running for a 2nd term. And that's, you know, before Bobby Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy, before everything really went south. So that when he actually stepped down and surprised everybody but her, or announced he wouldn't run again,
Right.
It you know, the story was told differently, that it was about what had happened in the last few years, but really they'd laid it out together just right after they came into the White House.
And especially that they laid out March of '68, that early. She
Right.
identified March, and that was ultimately the time, March 31st.
You're right.
So Tom, I'm curious, Tom, where did you and when did you see her influence on the president, as somebody in the press office and somebody who was around them, but a young man? Was her power obvious?
Her power was not obvious to those who I think were in the 2nd or 3rd rings, and I started beyond the 3rd ring, and perhaps
I was in the 5th or 6th. So
but,
you were in the 4th. You were
clearly, I was advised by Bill Moyers of Mrs. Johnson's enormous influence, and of course George Christian, who was one of those who President Johnson brought into the discussion about his stepping down, along with John Conley. But as I worked my way, I guess, up into the various positions, I saw the profound influence on him. And I also would just notice that when he would get really sort of upset, really upset, she would just frequently put her hand over gently on his arm, and these words, now Lyndon, now Lyndon. I saw that several times in very small meetings where he was either his anger or just his anguish would come. And she was a comforting force to him. But certainly I saw that later. And I should just say that during 2 years, when I was executive vice president of Texas Broadcasting, the family business, I reported through the president, a man named Jesse Kellum, but I reported to Mrs. Johnson, who was the chairman of the board of Texas Broadcasting. So during the Texas years, I came to really know her and admire her and become much, much closer to her. I should just tell you one story, though. On one occasion, Mrs. Johnson asked me to do something important. And for the life of me, I can't remember what it was. But the president sort of reached over to me and asked me to come sort of over to the side. And with that famous gesture, he sort of poked me in the chest and said exactly these words: Tom, don't forget that you work for me, not for Ladybird.
Tom froze.
Oh, Tom froze?
Did I freeze?
Everybody
Gail froze.
here?
Gail froze.
Gail froze.
We're here.
Anyway, just picking
Well,
up on that, I mean, President Johnson said to me, don't forget, Tom, you work for me, not for Ladybird. And yes, sir, Mr. President, got it.
Well, that's funny, Tom. I'll tell you, just share a very quick story. I once answered the phone in Jake Jacobson's office, who was one of his aides, and there was a special phone on everybody's desk that mattered that went straight to the president, and nobody was there but me, the little assistant. And I grabbed the phone because I knew it was the president. And I said, yes, Mr. President. And he said, where's Jake? And I said, I think he's downstairs waiting for the choppers to head to the airport and go to the ranch for the weekend. And he said, what are you talking about, ranch for the weekend? And I said, well, I think everybody's downstairs because it's your birthday and everybody's going to Texas for the weekend. And I knew Mrs. Johnson, the girls, everybody was there, and the rest. And he slammed the phone down. And as he slammed the phone down, he said, I'll decide whether we go to Texas. And they didn't go to Texas that weekend. So it's interesting when you hear those kind of stories by people. So, Julia, I'm very interested. For most of us, Lady Bird was the highway beautification wildflower lady. I mean, for those, we all knew about there were wildflowers on every highway we could think of because of Mrs. Johnson. But really, from your readings and the understanding, she was an environmentalist long before any of us knew what environmentalism was. Share a little of those stories. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, Gail, actually, that would have been the third piece of what surprised you most. So I'm glad you're asking about that. That phrase beautification, she really came to hate it, and she shook it off by the end of her time in the White House. She instructed her staff, and her staff instructed anyone that was reporting on her environmental agenda not to use the word. There's one thing, which is the highway beautification bill that is thought of as Lady Bird's bill, but then, and it's connected, there's her much larger environmental agenda. And what I discovered is that beautification was a euphemism that was put in place for her reluctantly. Some say they couldn't think of a better phrase to describe the environmentalism, but also you have to remember this was 1963, 1964, 1965. Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring was published in 1962. The American public's consciousness around environmentalism was very nascent, and she was aware of that. And so couching what she was doing as beautifying was, was a feminized way to conceal a much more radical environmental agenda. And what it was really about, and of course, beautifying highways was about regulating a huge industry that was connected to the automobile industry and the infrastructure of building highways that had been gushing with money from federal funds since the 1950s, and often built destroying communities on the edges of cities and with no kind of aesthetic or environmental attention to them. So it was not nothing to try to regulate the powers behind that. But then beyond, she really was focused on American cities. The early 60s was we were starting as a country to be able to look back at the impact of major urban renewal programs all over American cities. And they, like the highway programs, had destroyed many neighborhoods, displaced communities of color. And she was steeping herself as she got into this in the debates about what we would call environmental justice today, access to nature, democratic access to nature, and how to wed civil rights and environmental justice in American cities. And she focused most especially on Washington, D.C. Yeah. They were Texans, but they were Washingtonians, and they had been here for 30 years. And D.C. was the largest Black majority city in the country at the time, and also incredibly segregated. And the four quadrants of the city, most of white Washington lived in Northwest and the rest in the rest. And the deprivation of public resources for parks and swimming pools and the kinds of recreation that access to nature, I keep saying that phrase because she understood in her bones from the time she was a little kid that is what made us human. And she was sensitive to like the full portfolio of humanity. And so she was trying to use what little, almost no resources that the East Wing at the time had, but she organized philanthropists and architects and landscape architects and activists in Washington, D.C. to try to mobilize resources to desegregate access to nature and park systems for Washingtonians themselves. And it's a long story that I pull the thread through in the book because I was so surprised by the vision behind it.
No, it's interesting. I mean, we're still in the middle of the battle for statehood for DC. And
yes, we were.
It feels like
and
Mrs. Johnson was one of our first advocates.
The Johnsons were big advocates. It was called home rule at the time. And it was part and parcel of this vision of representation and participation and dollars for public services in the most generic sense.
So it's interesting when we think about Mrs. Johnson as a feminist and an environmentalist and someone dedicated to civil rights and human rights. It's a different portrait than what we see of her. I'm curious from both of you, did her feminism show, or was she really to everybody outside of the president just the wife behind the great man? Tom?
Well, I'll let Tom respond first.
Yeah,
Well, I think that all of us saw Mrs. Johnson as a person of substance. We saw her also as a person who loved words. I mean, her vocabulary and her use of words. I mean, she was so careful, even when she spoke, on her choice of words. What I call some of Mrs. Johnson's policies that would apply to today, her media policy, which Julia described in ways I've not seen it described, was that, and with Liz Carpenter, of course, Mrs. Johnson had wonderful press relations. But as Julia writes in the book, it was better to feed than to starve the beast of the fourth estate. I mean, and so she had this wonderful relationship with the East Wing press corps, where we were over on the West side just in battles, particularly over Vietnam. But there was another point about Mrs. Johnson. Some consider this a negative and others don't. And Julia covers this. My husband comes first. The girls come second. And there are many people, including Lucy and Linda, who have talked about how they felt their mother really put her highest priority on supporting LBJ. And to the extent she could, she was also striving to be a good mother. But it was different.
Julia, I'm interested.
Yeah, I mean, I would be shocked if I were to hear her ever describe herself as a feminist.
Yes.
But
I know, right.
But in the doing, in the behavior, I mean, and again, I would caution myself to not project too much onto her as a writer who obviously admires her talents. But when you actually look at everything that she said, and of course in 64 especially, the way she spoke about women and the way she highlighted throughout her presidency, spoke about women and to women, always emphasizing the importance of them pursuing, the ultimate multitasking nightmare, if you will, right? You can have it all and you must have it all. Spouse, wife, parent, civic activist, professional. Before Helen Gurley Brown was talking about having it all, Lady Bird was doing it and preaching that. But she was never calling herself a feminist. I think that her generation was part of that, of course. But then, of course, later in 1977, she shows up at the Houston National Conference of Women, and she says, I once thought that the women's movement was for my daughter's generation, but now I understand it's for all women of all generations. And if you really add up her work on civil rights, her work on the war on poverty, Great Society, environment, women, it paints a pretty feminist picture, most especially even if, you know, you were LBJ's staff, they had, as I said, this kind of equal, this jointness in terms of what they were doing in the White House and together. And that's pretty feminist of her and him.
Right. Well, I was very struck in reading the book, which I just hadn't thought about before, that Liz Carpenter, Bess Abel, I mean, that she made the office of the First Lady a substantive place with staff and budget, which really, I guess, nobody else had ever done before, even Eleanor Roosevelt.
Eleanor Roosevelt, I see Lady Bird really in that regard as the bridge between Eleanor Roosevelt and Hillary Clinton. And Eleanor Roosevelt worked very hard to promote her husband's policy agendas and her own issues that she cared about. And she had a massive press operation herself with her columns and her radio shows. But it was Lady Bird who is the first to staff up and to have a professional policy staff and communications staff and strategy staff. And importantly, and this is, I think, something she does draw from the Roosevelt model, to really knit together, but maybe more active, more explicitly through the character of Liz, a joint political operation between the East Wing and the West Wing. At least that's what that's what Liz and Lady Bird thought they were trying to do. I don't know if the West Wing was always so game.
There was enormous power vested in Liz and Bess, and Mrs. Johnson supported them. They're also, we in the West Side knew it, even though there were executives on that side of it, Marvin Watson being the best example, who really did not support, particularly when it came to budgets, did not support Liz. But I must tell you, what Liz could not do by persuasion, she just did by sheer force of personality, and used Mrs. Johnson to go to the president to get it. And I must tell you, it was amazing to watch. And I should tell you also, there's no question that we felt it, and it did it in a really nice way. I mean, there was one occasion when Liz asked Bill Moyers to loan me to her. And without really checking with me, Bill loaned me to Liz. I was the press secretary for Pat Nugent during the time leading up to the wedding and through the wedding. And I had such high responsibilities as going back and getting the shoes he had left in his room for the wedding. I mean, really major stuff for somebody the graduate of Harvard Business School and others. But it was really a wonderful relationship. And there were at least one or two people who were saved by Liz. I mean, staffers who were saved. Who was the author of Jaws? Peter Benchley. He was fired. And he went to Liz, and Liz says, "You can't be fired. You're the best humor writer I have, or one of the best." She went through Mrs. Johnson back to the president, and Peter was restored to power.
I have a question for Tom. Who other than Liz and Lady Bird, and let's include Bess, but especially Liz and Lady Bird, who other than those two had the kind of influence and pull and track record of success with the president?
Among the women, there was
among the men.
Among the men
on the West Side, yeah.
Right. Well, it certainly in the early days, Bill Moyers, until Bill left to become publisher of Newsday. Enormous relationship. Walter Jenkins. I mean, he was just, it's almost impossible to overstate the importance of Walter Jenkins to President Johnson, probably much more on the administrative side than on pure policy, but enormous. The president enjoyed his relationship very much with Jack Valenti, and Jack had a gift for being able to persuade the president at times in ways. Joe Califano, of course, Joe came later as a former deputy to Robert McNamara, but Joe had enormous impact on domestic policy issues on it. But no single male executive within the White House had quite as much as say, Clark Clifford on the outside, Abe Fortas on the outside. I mean, those two men had enormous power. Abe Fortas going back, for many, many years, as did Clark Clifford. So I said, looking outside of the immediate White House, those would be the two who really carried it. And Horace Busby, tremendous respect for Horace Busby as a writer and as an advisor, and as you write so well in this book. I mean, he was the one who drafted and redrafted the president's March 31st speech and many other speeches.
So one of the people Tom mentioned is Walter Jenkins. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about, Julia, was I don't think I really realized how much Mrs. Johnson pushed back on people to insist that they show support, whatever that they could, for Walter Jenkins. Tell us a little bit about that story and her role in it.
I think of the Walter Jenkins story as the October surprise of the 1964 presidential election, because both Johnsons had been campaigning. Lady Bird was in the South on her whistle stop tour, and LBJ was around the country and eventually in New York when a newspaper reporter that had been a colleague of Liz's from the Washington Star called her and said Jenkins is on the police blotter in DC. He had been arrested in some kind of homosexual act at a YMCA in Washington, DC. This was at a time when that was, Americans who were gays and lesbians weren't allowed to be open about their sexuality. And this was high risk for, politically speaking, for the White House. And that's how Clark Clifford and Abe Fortas treated it. They were the outside advisors. Well, by then, Abe Fortas was on the Supreme Court, and Lady Bird Johnson hears about it from Liz, and she comes up with a very different strategy, and from what Abe and Clark Clifford had proposed. Now, we have all of this on one of the tapes. So there's a 14-minute tape where you hear Lady Bird Johnson really completely mastering her main constituent in LBJ. Clifford and Abe Fortas have told LBJ that what they need to do is bury the story, isolate Walter Jenkins, say nothing publicly in support of him, but make sure that the story goes away because they're fearful that the GOP and Barry Goldwater are going to use this against Johnson in the campaign. Lady Bird calls and says, I want you to know, I'm paraphrasing here, I want you to know, honey, that I'm going to be asked about this. And when I am, what I'm going to say is a very humane statement in support of Walter Jenkins. And I'm going to propose to you right now that we help him set up in Texas, give him a high-level position at the radio station or somehow, and just make sure that he's protected and that his family is protected. And my statement is going to be a warm embrace and sympathetic. And LBJ said, absolutely not. That's not what these guys want to do. And by the end of the 14 minutes, he at one point says, actually, well, what you need to do is go ask Abe and Clifford what they think. And she says, oh, I already have. And she reports, and she's done her homework. She's already mapped out the whole strategy, and she's laying it out for him. And I think she's kind of one of the inventors of the Johnson treatment, because she says, oh, you poor darling, you're suffering so much. This is so hard for you. Now, listen, this is what is actually in your interest, not the approach you're going to take, but the approach that I've just devised for us. And in fact, that's what happens. He comes around, he says, okay, we'll put out a statement and we'll give him a job. And neither of those two things are what his two advisors had promoted. So it's kind of old politics versus new politics in a way, led by Lady Bird. She puts out her statement first, the West Wing follows, although with a bit of a wrinkle. And it really made a huge difference. And within a few years, it changed the way we started talking about, it's hard to draw the thread, but there was a great public support for Lady Bird's approach to this. And it, I think, helped begin to socialize how we talk about sexual preference in this country very differently.
Tom, did you have any thoughts about that?
Mrs. Johnson, when returned to Texas, embraced Walter Jenkins and his family. They had made certain that he had a program where there was compensation. I mean, they fulfilled all that Julia has just mentioned. I mean, he was probably the most devoted aide to LBJ during the years in the Senate and the vice presidency, and it was Mrs. Johnson was far more open about everything concerning the entire episode and cared so deeply about him. Before I forget it, I should just mention that on Israeli policy, that Arthur Krim and Lou Wasserman were very influential. Arthur, of course, and Lou, both giants in the motion picture industry, both of whom had been strong supporters of President Kennedy. But you ask about advisors. I can't omit the importance of Lou and Arthur, not only on Israeli politics, but on many other issues.
And how about Matilda Krim?
Matilda Krim was a power.
She's got an incredible story. She's on my radar, by the way, for another writing project, but she was very important.
Yes, and particularly in cancer research, she was very much a leader at Sloan Kettering. She had developed interferon, which was one of the most highly promising cancer medicines of that era, and it's still being used, I think, in a variety of ways. But she was not only beautiful and charming, but rocket science smart. And LBJ enjoyed her presence, and along with Arthur on many occasions. They were like a couple of choice for many of their trips, both domestically and internationally.
So one other thing that I want to get to while we're all here together, because I think it's so important. And Julia, you write in various different times, and it comes up in all the literature about LBJ, are his many bouts with depression. And it's certainly a passion of Tom's. And so, Julia, I'll begin with you. How did Lady Bird deal with the depression? And was it something that she publicly spoke about, or was it just something private between them? How did it live in their life?
She recorded in her audio diaries often about what she called the black beast of depression, the valley of the black pig. She had a long history of understanding LBJ's bouts with depression and of helping him recover from them. She, this was part of how essential she was to him. I mean, people weren't treated for depression then the way now in terms of medical and psychotherapy availability. It was a huge part of their lives. And I think that, there are some surprises that, by the way, so no, I never came across her speaking publicly about his depression, but she did speak about it into her tape recorder all the time. She also, by the way, talked about her own depression, which I think wasn't clinical, but she had ups and downs. She was a total human being. I think I'm gleaning, it went through menopause during the years she was in the White House. She experienced exhaustion and emotional ups and downs. And then she had to work. You ask, how did it live in their lives? she had to work very hard to keep herself extremely healthy because he required that of her. And so not only was she disciplined with her audio recording and everything else, but she was disciplined with her exercise. She was constantly monitoring her sleep and what she was eating and what he was eating. And there's a moment that did surprise me that's in the book, and I don't want to give away the whole story, where after one of his surgeries at Bethesda Naval Hospital, he sinks into one of these deep depressions. And the photos show it. The photos at the LBJ Library are an incredible documentary history that you can really see how the two of them, their bond helps get him back on his feet. I mean, he talks about wanting to resign. He talks about just wanting to go back to the ranch. He's buried under an avalanche of work. And she bucks him up time and time again, sometimes to a fault. And I know I'm going on a little bit about this, but I've been talking about this book so much. One of the things I think is that sometimes his decision-making around Vietnam, he thrived off of momentum. So she would, if he had a big decision to make, encourage him to make that decision because the momentum helped snap him out of his depression.
Interesting. Tom, what did you see of depression in his life?
Of course, my own depression was diagnosed in my mid 40s. I had a very serious streak of it, and I think as I look back based on my own experience, that I saw those indicators. I mean, he would have, just as Julia's mentioned, these sort of prolonged periods of being down. And that was probably the one she mentioned, probably the longest one. But it unquestionably, Lbj suffered from depression. I know that Mrs. Johnson, again, as Julia has in her book, Mrs. Johnson would have private sessions with Dr. Willis Hurst from Emory University and from Dr. James Kane of the Mayo Clinic. She frequently talked with them about it. But I was asked many years ago, did I think that Lbj battled depression? That was before I was hit with it. I said, no, I don't think that he was. But now I'm absolutely convinced that he had these bouts of depression. They were serious. I also saw him at a time where it was very, very high, very high. It makes you think in a way there was to some extent, some bipolar. I know at one point that Bill Moyers and Nick Goodwin discussed that issue and even discussed with some outside doctors about it. But I mean, he was such a force of nature, though, and when he could just continue to with these meetings and convincing people to do what he wanted them to do, that force that he had. So it was not something that it was very visible to the outside world, to the public, but I think it was visible to those who were on the inside.
So it's interesting to me. Everybody talks about what a political animal he was. But when in reading the book in great depth, I mean, she is a surrogate out there on the road from Jackie Kennedy's days, when they're running as vice president, all the way through all of his campaigns. Is she as political? Is it born in her the way it is in him?
Well, no, she grew into it. She grew into it. And, she was very devoted to him and had to make a choice early on that meant politics. And she came to really see how that could be a universe that she could thrive in. I mean, I wasn't without sacrifices, as we were talking about. When you're trying to get pregnant, as she was, dealing with miscarriages, having little babies, having to go out 5 nights a week in Washington, D.C., schlep back and forth between D.C. and Texas to keep all of those plates spinning. but you can see with the images, and you can see as she grows into it, as you mentioned, especially the 1960 campaign and then onward. But even well before, in the Senate campaigns and not the first, but the second House campaign, she is out there on the rope line. She's documenting every aspect of his operation. She's gathering intelligence. She's spreading intelligence. Obviously, she's helping finance the very first campaign. So I think she wasn't quite born to it, but she sure grew into it.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about the Lady Bird special. I mean, that was as political, I mean, as rigorous a political event as you could have.
It was, and just to tell the people watching what that was, it was in October of 1964, after the Civil Rights Bill had passed. LBJ says to Bill Moyers, "We've lost the South for many generations to come." Lady Bird, whose family is from Alabama, says, "Yeah, but I don't want to lose it by default." So she takes 8 states, 47 stops, 4 days, and she starts in Alexandria, Virginia, and she lands in New Orleans. And she makes her case to predominantly white Southerners, although the crowds were mixed, but the objective was not to lose the South. So she was making the case that the New South could buy into the Democratic Party and her president's vision of leavening the racial playing field. And that means she got death threats on that trip.
Yeah, I'm going to step in here for just a second.
Sure.
Because I know there is so much interest in the book. Julia's got another event that she's going to run to in about 5 minutes. One question, and if you have any other questions, you can put them in the Q&A box. But one question is, she gave LBJ support, and the stories that, like Tom said, of putting her hand on, where did she get her support?
Well, I think she did get it from him. They were quite the partnership. She got it from her own counsel. She was a woman who also derived great groundedness from spending time alone. They were a study in contrast. He hated to be alone. She needed to be alone. She needed actually to get away from him, and he knew that. She would flee to the ranch and go on these 10-day hiking trips by herself or with a Secret Service person. And she was a beautiful nature writer, so she wrote about it. But I think more than anything, she derived her inner strength from her own inner strength, and also from her kids, and from knowing how crucial she was to his presidency.
Tom, you feel the same?
I feel exactly the same.
Good.
Exactly the same. She had close friends, and yet I believe most of it came from her own inner strength. At times she would turn to Lucy and to Linda, but I think more in trying to nurture them. But I do know that later on, Lucy and Linda did that. But it's really interesting because of all the various friends that she had. I just think that it mostly came from within.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Julia, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just, Julia, before you have to go, what do you hope your book does for the views of Lady Bird Johnson, and reason, the thing you hope people get from it?
Well, number one, I hope people document their own history. I don't think that it's significant that she was in the White House and doing this as First Lady, but I think that that documenting one's own history is really vital, no matter where one is in life or station. The second thing is that I'm really taken, and I hope people understand from this book, by her, the progressive vision that she had for the country, and the the willingness to study and to do the heavy lifting, to work toward making the country a better place. I mean, that's very simple, but she was such a hard worker, and she was so devoted to the notion that we could build a floor and keep the ceiling not too high in terms of inequality, that part of democracy meant civil rights and access to all of the public services that she brought. And I think we associate his domestic agenda with LBJ, but I want people to understand how vital she was to the ambitions that President Johnson had as well.
Wow.
Tony, I just want to say, though, once again, Julia captures Lady Bird Johnson. And I came away after concluding this, I so wish that we had the type of in-depth understanding of more of the people in public life. And I think about a number of people, starting with maybe Hillary Clinton. I would really like to know much more about Hillary Clinton, but I could name others. I mean, Julia has taken sort of the wrap off of this and given you a chance to really see. And I compare that with what now I think about the very shallow biographies of many of the people I've seen in public life and want a Julia Sweig biography of them.
Thank you, Tom.
Julia's got to go. We're going to keep talking
okay.
for a little bit. But
thank you very
Julia,
much.
Thank you.
Julia,
thank you very much.
Right, Julia,
wonderful to be
terrific
here with
job.
you. Thank you so much.
I'm a top critic, Julia. This is superb.
Yeah.
Splendid.
Thank you so much.
Everybody
all right. Thanks for having me. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Tom, one thing that strikes me is, did you see a change in Lady Bird Johnson from the type of person you saw at the White House to when they moved to the ranch?
I saw this very solid Lady Bird Johnson all the way, but his death, LBJ's death, freed her to do so much that she had always wanted to do herself, her own travels, her own, real adventures. I mean, I guess it's sad to say this, but I mean, she was almost trapped in a way in his life during all those years in public service on it. Now, she started doing just many, many more things with Lucy and with Linda. I mean, she would do all type of annual trips to Martha's Vineyard. We would went there with her often in August. So she was more relaxed. She had this opportunity to be herself and not have to be under sort of the influence of the president's schedule, his needs.
So Tom, I'm curious, in being herself, did she ever have any other men in her life that interested her?
I asked her that about her years before LBJ, and I got a lot of laughter from her, but never any answers. And there were no other men after she left. Probably the closest was Harry Middleton, the director of the LBJ library. She enjoyed Harry Middleton. Harry traveled with her, particularly to the Martha's Vineyard. And frequently she would take Liz, incidentally. Liz could sort of organize all of these dinners, all of these lunches. But Harry was a terrific writer, had enormous depth, and she really enjoyed Harry. I think I don't think there was ever any romance, but there was just tremendous affection.
And I'm curious, did you ever observe any of her relationship with Jackie Kennedy?
Every time we went to Martha's Vineyard, there was a day, and she kept it even very private from those of us who were her guests. She spent a day with Jackie Kennedy at Martha's Vineyard every single year. And I was so pleased to see the way Julia dealt with that relationship, because It's as awkward as it was at different times. Tremendous respect and affection developed between those two women.
And I have one more question for Tom that's not really on the book and things, but today's political polarization, a lot of people want to say is similar to the days what LBJ faced in the 60s. Do you think that we're finishing the work of the 60s today, or do you think the world is totally different?
I think the world is so totally different, Gail. I think that we were able to reach across the aisle and get Everett Dirksen to help us pass the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, but being able to bring the Republicans down to the White House, have not one, but two or maybe three drinks together, have an opportunity, but in the evenings, especially to socialize, get to know each other. We're now the politicians and the single issue sort of districts of today, the way in which it's come together. In my opinion, we are at probably the worst period of American history. And I've gone back to try to read about the early brawls and the duels and everything else. I think this is the worst period that I know or have read about in American history in terms of our divisiveness, and how I so wish there were a way to bring back the Everett Dirksens and the I should also tell you, I had such hope for people like Lamar Alexander that, you know, I thought there were going to be some Republicans that would really stand up against the onslaught of what we've seen. It's a terrible, terrible situation today, and I don't know what to do about it. I had hoped that a James Baker and a Colin Powell and a Sam Nunn, that we would have people like them who put country ahead of politics would emerge, but they aren't. I'm not seeing them.
No. I know, it's interesting. One of the people listening to our call tonight, I think, is Katie Barksdale, who was Howard Baker's press secretary.
Well, Howard Baker was a terrific example of somebody who would work together. Often would work together. I mean, where are the Howard Bakers, for God's sake?
Yeah.
So
in fact, I remember when President Carter and Senator Baker were together at the Carter Library, and they talked about those days of working across the aisles. So it would be nice to find people like that again. We have come to the end of the program. It was a fascinating program. For our listeners, you can get a copy of Julia's book about Lady Bird Johnson with an autographed book plate from Acapella Books. I would encourage you to do that. And as Gail and Tom have said as well, it's an excellent way to learn about Lady Bird Johnson. So Gail and Tom, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Tony. And Tony, I would just say they had so many Georgia friends. Senator Russell, Betty Talmadge, Mrs. Carter, particularly after the White House, Bo Calloway, Beth Calloway, Dottie Fuqua, J.B. Fuqua, his doctor, Willis Hurst. I mean, for those Georgians who are on the line, the book doesn't cover that, but they had some incredibly important friends and allies here in Georgia, especially Senator Russell, even though LBJ had to run over his old friend Dick Russell over the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you all for joining us tonight. Thanks to Gail and Tom and Julia. And be sure and get your copy of the book from Acapella Books. Have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Bye.